We're good to go.
All right. So it looks like we do have a quorum. I would note that Terry Rosenblatt is joining us. Ben was unable to be with us today and asked that Terry, pursuant to our bylaws, sit in for him as a participating non-voting member. So Terry is with us in that capacity today. So thank you for joining us, Terry, and please give Ben all of our best. We also
Commissioner
do
Green.
not, yes.
Oh, I was just saying thank you.
Oh, the delays on these WebEx. Next, Scott O'Neill is not with us today. Scott is sick today and couldn't make it. Scott serves on the commission by virtue of his role as head of the Crime Lab Directors Association. His term, as I understand it, will expire, either has expired or will expire before our next meeting. So Scott will no longer be a member of the commission. So we did want to acknowledge Scott's service to the commission. You know, he's been an invaluable resource from my perspective. You know, just a very active, participating, productive member of the commission. And I know on top of everything else he has to do, that's been a lot of work, but, just want to make sure he knows and everybody knows how much we appreciate his service. We had hoped he would be able to be with us today, but obviously he couldn't. So we are going to send Scott a plaque from all of us in recognition of his service to the commission. Just in terms of housekeeping, I'd ask if people aren't speaking, if you can mute yourself. Otherwise, sometimes we get feedback. And other than that, I think we are ready to begin. I think the first thing I've got to do is take attendance just to establish that we have a quorum. So in Albany, I think I see Ann Willie, is that right?
Yep.
All right, and I see Jill Dooley. Yeah. All right, and then we've got Lydia DeCastro with us, is that right?
Yes.
All right, and Jessica Goldthwait.
Yes.
Myself, I always forget to include myself in these. Mike Marciano. And then we've got Judge Mazzarelli and Bill Fitzpatrick. If I'm not mistaken, Natasha, I think that does give us a quorum. Is that right?
Correct.
All right, giving the thumbs up. So I believe everyone has received an updated draft agenda for today's meeting. Is there any discussion with regard to that agenda? And if not, do I have a motion to approve the agenda? Motion by Judge Mazzarelli. Do I have a second?
Second.
Lydia, thank you. And again, we have to do the votes, unfortunately, by roll call. So I'll take the vote now. And just so I don't forget myself, I vote yes. Ann?
Yes.
Jill?
Yes.
Lydia?
Yes.
Jessica?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
Judge?
Yes.
Bill?
Yes.
All right, that passes. Thank you. Hopefully nobody is offended by my informality with first names. If you are, let me know and I'll be happy to use a different title. The second thing we have on our agenda is approval of the draft minutes from our June 4th, 2021 meeting. Those minutes were circulated. Are there any questions or comments with regard to those minutes? If not, do I have a motion to approve those minutes?
Motion.
Right. And Jill, do I have a second? Judge? Again, roll call vote, so I vote yes. Ann?
Yes.
Jill?
Yes.
Lydia?
Yes.
Jessica?
Yes.
Mike?
Yep.
Judge?
Yes.
And Bill?
Yes.
All right, so that carries.
And your
Next,
vote, sir? He got it. He did it. Okay, sorry.
I voted
That's
first.
good.
I'm making a concerted effort not to forget myself today.
I'm trying here. I'll leave it to Natasha now.
All right, next we have our accreditations and laboratory updates. The first item is the Erie County Central Police Services Forensic Laboratory. This is for informational purposes. There's no vote required. There's a letter in the materials from July 1st regarding continuation of accreditation. There's correspondence from August 26th, as I read it, regarding the scope and the certification that was received. And then there's an email chain from September 3rd regarding an update on the scope. As I read the materials, there was a surveillance document review. There were no findings. A&AB issued a continuation of accreditation in July and updated the scope documents in August, and then made administrative changes to the scope and sent us an updated copy. Any questions or comments with regard to this item? All right. Next, we have the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Toxicology. This item does require a vote. There's a letter, again, as I read the materials, from August 29th of this year with regard to reaccreditation by ABFT. There's an email from August 20th with regard to the ABFT checklist and attached documentation. There's a letter from September 8th with regard to remediation of corrective actions. Again, as I read the materials, there were 3 audit activities between April of 2021 and August of 2021. As I read it, there were multiple findings, but the laboratory has addressed each of those findings to ABFT's satisfaction, and ABFT did vote to reaccredit the laboratory. In addition, there was a letter from Dr. Cooper from the laboratory with regard to an explanation of the remediation. I do believe Dr. Cooper is available, and I also believe Dr. Jones is available to speak on behalf of ABFT. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I have a question for Graham, if he could get on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yes.
Hi, Graham. This is Jill.
Hi.
I just have a question. Based on what we typically see in assessment activities, it's usually either remote or some sort of a hybrid or an in-person, but this one seems like you actually had 3 different concerted efforts. Can you just explain why that was?
Yeah, they were linked. There was an initial assessment arranged that took place over April and into May. What happened there was that inspection team provided a draft report, but that report was never completed, and the findings that were listed in that draft report were never discussed with Dr. Cooper. So it was kind of left hanging. So as chair of the accreditation program, I picked that up and contacted Dr. Cooper, and the draft report was sent to Dr. Cooper as well initially by the inspection team, and asked her if she could address those findings and send me supportive information, which she did. I believe I gave her until the end of July to do that, and in fact, I think by July 17th or 18th, she had responded to me with a list of explanations and supportive material to demonstrate that most of those initial findings were in fact not supported findings. They were, the laboratory was in compliance for most of the items in that draft report. So I issued basically or amended the original report or corrected the original report. But because of the circumstances, I felt it was appropriate and reasonable to have one of our inspectors to go to the New York lab to visit with Dr. Cooper and look at materials on site. That was Dr. Robert Middleberg. He did that, sent a report back to me. and on the basis of that, finalize the report that you will have seen in your package, and then ask the board, the ABFT board, to reaccredit the laboratory.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else have questions or comments either for Graham or Dr. Cooper?
Mike, I just have a comment that I was glad that Dr. Cooper and appreciated the fact that she sent that supplemental letter, because that helped with a lot of the questions that I had initially had with reviewing the document in the first binder. So I just wanted to say that, that was helpful, which means I don't have any questions.
I agree. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Cooper. Anything else? All right. If there are no other questions, do I have a motion to grant New York State accreditation to the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Toxicology Laboratory, for a period concurrent with their ABFT accreditation to expire June 30th, 2023?
So moved.
Moved.
All right. And I'm sorry, who was that moved? Was that Lydia?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Bill, you seconded?
Second, yep.
All right, thank you. I vote yes. Ann?
Yes.
Jill?
Yes.
Lydia?
Yes.
Jessica?
Yes.
Mike?
Yep.
Judge? And Bill?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So that passes. So next we have the New York City. I'm
Commissioner,
sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I think I saw my colleague, Terry Rosenblatt, had a hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
I
that's
missed
okay. Sometimes they're hard to notice.
Terry,
know if
if
questions
you
been
have a
answered.
question or you want to make a comment, just unmute yourself and yell at me and I will gladly acknowledge you. So my apologies. Go
Oh,
ahead.
you might be sorry for that invitation.
Yeah.
But thank you. No, my question was just on page 25 and 26 of the materials. There was a note and some guidance about changing the way the documents are managed to a central system, because the way that it's managed now has the potential for omissions. And so my question was whether that was resolved, and if the lab was taking any action to get a centralized system. And if not, or I guess even if, how are documents being sort of compiled to disclose to the defense?
I'm assuming Dr. Cooper or someone who works for her would be in the best position to answer that. Is she still available?
Gail, if you could raise your hand and Elizabeth could unmute you. I will try to text her and see what's happening.
All right, thanks. As soon as we voted, she hung up on us, huh?
She's trying to connect. Just give her a second.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Shelley, would it make
Hello?
sense? Oh, all right, I think we're set. All right. So
Hello,
Terry,
Mr.
maybe if you can repeat your question.
Sure, and thank you so much for logging back on for this. My question related to the pages 25 and 26 of our materials, which are 12 and 13, and it's section C2. And the issue was that there was a recommendation that the lab implement some kind of centralized or unifying software system to have a single source for compiling documents. And so my question was whether the lab was taking any action on that, and sort of relatedly, what steps the lab takes now to make sure that all documents are compiled together to meet discovery obligations.
Okay, can you just repeat which letter it was for the checklist?
And I'm sorry, I just didn't hear you.
I asked if you can repeat the letter of the checklist item for the questions. I could find it in our report.
Yes, I believe it was C-2.
C-2. Okay, let me just check that. The C-2 refers to the expansion of a scope. I think you were looking about documentation. So I don't think I'm not looking at the same thing as you are.
Yes, the note is on page 13 of the ABFT paperwork, and it says RM, with respect to C-2, it is highly recommended that the laboratory considers a unifying software, e.g. Qualtrics.
Oh, yes. Okay, I don't need to find it. I know the reference now. But yeah, I mean, we are providing everything manually, and we don't have an automated system, and that was the recommendation to purchase for example, the Qualtrics application, so that everything can be done automatically and not require manual steps. There's really no issue with respect to any problems with the data being provided. It just takes us longer because we're doing it manually. Our agency does have licenses with Qualtrics, so we will be integrating into that system, but there's no immediate rush to do that. There's no non-compliance with documentation for discovery. It's just ADFT we're recommending to avoid any potential delays or issues to have a more automated system.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, next we have the New York City Police Department Laboratory. This is for informational purposes. There is no vote required. As I read the materials, there's a letter dated July 21st with regard to a change in management, and then an acknowledgement of the same the following day. And the notification was that Stephanie O'Shea has been appointed Quality Assurance Manager. She had previously been the acting Quality Assurance Manager, and ANAB has acknowledged receipt of the notification. So any questions or comments with regard to this item? All right, next we have the Onondaga County Center for Forensic Sciences. Again, this is for informational purposes. There's no vote required. There's a letter, as I read the materials, dated July 20th of this year with regard to notification of the laboratory director and an acknowledgement the following day. And my reading is that Renee Ho has been appointed as the laboratory director. And then I have a note here from staff that we have received her CV and can provide it to any of the commission members upon request. Any comments or questions with regard to this item? All right, next we have the Suffolk County Crime Laboratory. Again, for informational purposes, there's a email from August 27th with regard to the appointment of chief and assistant chief. There's an email chain starting September 10th with regard to reassessment report, corrective action plan, and acknowledgement of the receipt of the same. There's a memo from September 14th with regard to the approval of the corrective action plan. So as I read the materials, the lab has officially appointed Donald Doler as chief and Constance Dinkel as assistant chief, effective August 23rd. The lab had a full reassessment audit in August. The audit resulted in 8 non-conformances. As I read it, in 2 conforming with comments. The lab has proposed its corrective action plan to the lead assessor as of September 14th. The lead assessor had approved most of the corrective actions, but it looks like they still intend to issue a supplemental document with regard to additional comments. And the lab has until October 18th to resolve all of the non-conformances. Any questions or comments with regard to this item?
Mike?
Yes.
I just wanted to point out that I believe that their accreditation is doesn't expire till the end of the year. So they have plenty of time to work on these responses to the non-conformances. So we don't have to do an extension. At least that's my understanding.
Yes, I believe that's our understanding as well. And either Jill or Shelley, can you just comment for the commission? As I understand it here, there was some confusion around our getting the documentation. Can you just briefly describe what that was?
I would be happy to. I'm not, we may have lost Jill a little. Are you there, Jill?
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear Jill. We just can't see her at the moment.
Yeah, so I think at this point I am so frazzled by not having a camera and all the sound issues. So Shelley, can you take this?
Sure. So the audit report we typically get at the closeout or near the closeout of the audit, the assessment activity, and we had known that it was out there, but we hadn't seen anything. So the first place that we received it was from the laboratory. The laboratory provided it when they provided the response to A&AB, but typically that's the role of the of A&AB. The lead assessor typically provides that to us. So we've seen over time some changes with how we're receiving information from A&AB, but the lab looped us in. And we've reached out to A&AB and clarified that we should have received it earlier, and there was some confusion. But they've assured us that they're speaking with the lead assessors, and that should not happen in the future. But just we should have probably received this a week or two before we did. But we did end up getting it eventually when the lab provided it. So.
All right, thank you. And I just, from my perspective, the concern would be, we should be getting this as a matter of course from A&AB, so it's not incumbent on the labs, to then notify us. So if there is any issue in the future with that, I would suggest let us know right away. And as a commission, we can communicate to A&AB what our expectations are. But hopefully this takes care of it. Any other comments or questions with regard to this? And then I assume this will be on our December agenda to hopefully review the corrective action plan and hopefully A&AB's approval of the same.
I had a few questions.
Sure.
Thanks. One, I guess, is a general one. In the course of an audit, and then the lab's initial response for a remedy plan, is there any review of cases that could be affected by the non-conformance? Does that happen later? Because my understanding is during the audit, sometimes or casework is actually reviewed, selected casework. But I wondered if the lab could speak to that, whether there's a plan of review of cases. I asked because it seems like I mean, all nonconformities are serious, but some of these seem particularly serious, and I just wanted to know whether casework was being evaluated for impact.
Yep, we have members from the lab present, and Elizabeth, if you could unmute the raised hand. It should be Connie, the quality manager, assistant lab director.
Connie?
They may speak up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, as a matter of corrective action, we have a root cause process that we go through post-assessment that includes a full evaluation of our processes, how we plan to address those corrective actions, and then if the corrective action warrants us to go back to old casework, we will do that. And depending on the intricacies of the finding, that will dictate how many cases we look at, how long we go back into our previous and analyzed cases, and then what we will do going forward with cases that we will be analyzing.
Thanks, that's helpful. Have you made that determination yet, or is that what you're currently in the process of trying to work out?
That's what we're in the process of trying to work out. Some of the findings are easier to fix and address, so those corrective actions have actually already been written up this week, and we plan on providing them to the lead assessor in the near future. But the corrective actions that involve a little bit more work, we need to evaluate how many cases we're going to go back and look at, if that makes sense.
If I could ask while we've got you about a couple of the non-conformities in particular. Sorry, I'm just flipping through the pages here. So I'm looking at number 3, which would be for the commission members, page 471 of the materials. And for your reference, this is the non-conformity related to 7.2.1.1.2. So that's number 3. I'm looking actually at your lab response memo. But this relates to any test method that involves comparison of an unknown to a known, where you have to identify the characteristics of the unknown that are suitable for comparison prior to actual comparison with the known sample. And it looks like several disciplines were found not to be in compliance: impressions, firearms, and seized drugs. First, can I just ask a basic question? Is impressions just latent prints? Is it also like shoe prints, or what is impressions, and what's the scope of sort of forensic work that's encompassed by impressions?
Suffolk County Crime Lab does not do latent print analysis, so the impressions discipline is just for footwear and tire tracks.
Footwear and tire tracks, okay. So can you just help me understand a little bit more about the nature of this nonconformity? And again, your response was helpful in understanding it, but does this mean, just if you can help me break it down as sort of a simple example, say you have a shoe print and you want to compare it to known shoe prints that you find during a Google search, or if you did use a database in a database or something, the analysis initially, you would mark those parts of the shoe print that were clear enough, of high enough quality, and I guess probative enough that you would actually compare them to a known standard. And please stop me if I'm just getting this radically wrong. But if that's an example, is it that the analysts aren't doing that? Are they just not documenting it? Can you just help me understand what's going on here with this nonconformance?
Yeah, actually across the disciplines that were addressed under this Q versus K finding, it was that they were actually all doing it. It's just it wasn't being documented clearly enough. So upon interview with the analyst, they were satisfied that we were addressing the Q before the K, but their concern was in our notes, it wasn't clearly documented and could not clearly be expressed to the customer that we were addressing the Q prior to the K.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, just from a defense perspective, right, I can see that. I mean, it's good to hear that these characteristics are being marked before comparison, obviously, right? But if, say, I have a case in which this evidence is, being used to prosecute one of my clients, I'm going to want to retain an outside expert to examine it. And if these notes aren't clear enough, obviously, then my expert is going to have a difficult time figuring out how the conclusion was actually reached. Do you have any sense? Sorry, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
If I may comment further, when I was trained as an assessor, my understanding of this particular standard involved being able to interview the analyst and get a clear understanding of what they were looking at for the Q versus the K, and then documenting it further. So that's why you see the trend across 3 disciplines, because that's how I trained our staff. And then as we went through this reassessment, it was clear that we needed further documentation. So that's why you see a consistency among 3 disciplines, not just one specific.
Mm-hmm. Do you have, I may have asked your lab this before, I apologize if so, but do you do pre-trial meetings with prosecutors and defense?
Yes.
Okay, so if there was a question, say, in a tool mark comparison in the firearms section, a defense attorney could arrange a meeting with an analyst and ask questions about what's going on.
Do allow that, yes.
Okay. Obviously, that's no substitute for having the information in the report, but I was curious. That's good. Sorry, I just had questions about a couple more. Number 5, for commissioners, I'm looking at page 472 and 473. So this is number 5 of the Suffolk County's response. And this relates to technical records and firearms, crime scene, and seized drugs, about, I suppose, the reports not containing the original observations necessary to support the reported conclusions. Could you just explain that a bit more?
This is also a similar finding to what we just previously discussed. All of the work was being done. However, we would say something, for example, in firearms, that the sample was either in or out. And to us, that was an observation, but to the assessors, that was a conclusion. So what we're going to do now is firearms has generated additional documents and worksheets so that we can clearly articulate what those observations are. And then when their conclusions are generated in the report, it'll be supported by the documents within the case file. And that went for each of the additional subdisciplines.
Mm-hmm. In some of these disciplines, or maybe all of them, are there photographs taken where points of comparison, if this is possible, are marked?
We don't take our own photographs in crime scene, but that now is something that we're going to require to be included in the case file so that we can go back and look at those photographs to aid in the note-taking process. In seized drugs, we are now going to include either a color photocopy of the TLC plate so that it's easy to see where the spot has risen, and not so much the color, but definitely the shape of the spot as well as the movement of the spot. And again, in firearms, we're going to generate additional worksheets so that you can see what the observations were prior to the conclusion generated.
Thanks. And my last question, and this may be similar to the other 2 non-conformances, is number 6. So that starts on page 473 of the commission documents, and it's number 6 of the Suffolk County response. This relates only to the seized drug discipline and concerns whether the technical record supports the result for an identification, I suppose, of the drug, right? And it seems like there wasn't enough support for the actual identification. Is that a similar situation where it's just not recording the information necessary to make an identification, or were there erroneous identifications?
Nope, it's a similar situation. In fact, we were told that once 72112 is rectified, then 7513 would become rectified as well with the changes that we make for that. Unfortunately, a lot of these standards tie into one another. So those 3
Right.
specific standards that you've highlighted all actually are related.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments? All right, thank you. And we look forward to seeing more at our December meeting here. Next, we have the Westchester County Division of Forensic Sciences. And we have a letter dated July 6th regarding continuation of accreditation. This is for informational purposes. There's no vote. As I read the materials, ANAB conducted a surveillance activity in June of this year, and there were no findings. The lab continues to be in compliance with accreditation standards. ANAB has issued a continuation of accreditation letter, an updated certificate and scope, and the next accreditation activity will be June of 2022. We obviously have Lydia here with us. Does anyone have any questions? All right, next we have the Westchester County Division of Forensic Toxicology. Again, for informational purposes, no vote required. As I read it, we have a letter dated June 17th of this year. It was a follow-up to the commission's request asking for clarification. If people recall, at our last meeting, there was a discussion with regard to continuing education for analysts and whether or not there was a union agreement that prohibited the lab requiring continuing education. I believe that that's been clarified and that in fact there is no such agreement prohibiting that. And then there's also a notification announcing Mary Jane, and I'll probably butcher this last name, Massa is the quality assurance manager. Any questions or comments with regard to this item? All right. Next, we have the Westchester County Department of Public Safety. There's a letter from June 16th of this year with regard to continuation of accreditation. As I read it, ANAB conducted surveillance activity in June of this year and there were no findings. The lab continues to be in compliance with accreditation standards. ANAB has issued a continuation of accreditation letter, and the next accreditation activity is in June of 2022. Any questions or comments with regard to this item? All right, next we have the Yonkers Police Department Forensic Science Laboratory. There is a vote required for this item. We have a letter dated June 15th of this year, as I read it, with regard to renewal of accreditation. As I read the materials in May of this year, ANAB conducted a renewal accreditation assessment. There were no findings. ANAB has renewed their accreditation through September 30th of 2025. Any questions or comments with regard to this item? All right, and I do see that our camera is back on with regard to our members in Albany, so hopefully that means we can take a vote. So if there are no questions or comments, do I have a motion to grant New York State accreditation to the Yonkers Police Department Forensic Science Laboratory for a period concurrent with their ANAB accreditation to expire September 30th, 2025? All right, Judge, thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, thank you. Ann, well, I'll start again so I don't forget myself. I vote yes. Ann?
Yes.
Jill?
Yes.
Lydia?
Yes.
Jessica?
Yes.
Mike?
Yep.
Judge?
Yes.
And Bill?
Yes.
All right, that motion carries. Thank you. Next, we have the Niagara County Sheriff's Office Forensic Laboratory. This is for informational purposes. No vote is required. As I read it, there's a letter from September 13th of this year with regard to an interim director and quality manager, and then a letter dated the following day with regard to management change. As I read the materials, effective September 3rd, Tom DeFanzio has been named interim director. Michelle Scotland has been named quality assurance manager, and K. Paul Myers has been named serology supervisor. Did anyone have any questions? I will also note that that we will be discussing this later in the agenda as well, but does anyone have any questions at this point with regard to those items? All right, thank you. All right, so that finishes that section of the agenda. The next section of the agenda is old business. And the first item there is familial search update. Either Jill or Shelley, someone take us through that, please.
As long as you can hear me. You can hear me and see me now.
Can hear you clearly, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So in terms of update for the familial search program, there have been 48 applications in total with 8 resubmissions and 2 renewals. So 38 unique applications. Of those, 33 have been approved, 13 rejected, and 2 withdrawn. Of the 33 that have been approved, we have 9 that are in queue or in process, and 24 have been completed.
Any questions or comments with regard to the familial search update? Ann?
Jill, are we tracking outcome? I mean, so for those that have been done and info, do we know if there's been any cases that have been resolved by any of this? Are we going to track that element of the effort?
Yes. So far, there is 1 case where a suspect has been charged. There are 9 cases that are still have continuing investigations.
Okay. So of the 48, 1 led to a charge of a suspect?
Right.
Okay, and 9 are in progress?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That one was a homicide. Was a homicide or rape case? Recall, Jill?
That was a homicide, I believe.
Yeah.
Mike, can I ask a question?
Please.
We, in Onondaga, we submitted a case that was approved. Staff went through training, including members of my office. And then we were told there was no lead. I'm wondering if we might change that so that if we know there's no lead, that we don't have to go through the training, because you know I've objected in the past to having go through multiple trainings, so it seems kind of pointless to go through the training and then be told, oh, by the way, there's no lead.
Yeah, you know, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we committed to reviewing the process, and I don't know if it's regulations that we put in place on a regular basis. So certainly that is something, you know, the next time we do that review, that's something we could look at. But right now, at least as I read the regulations that we have around this, that training is required before any results can be released, and it doesn't specify what the results are. So I don't think I can just administratively, you know, say, yeah, we'll dispense with that. But I certainly think that as part of our regular review of these, we can look at that item.
Okay,
And
thank you.
I just want to mention also that in the event where there is no candidate name released, we do abbreviate the training. And I do think that it's still of value for folks, because it still gives you the information about the searching process, and also that you can renew that search in 6 months. And so we give you the contact information, the application for renewal, and if you have any questions, we give you the contact information for the state police folks as well as our office.
Thanks, Jill.
You're welcome.
Anything else on this item?
I just wanted to know what completed means. So Jill said, of the 33 approved, 9 were in queue and 24 completed. So completed means what exactly?
That the training has been executed. So it depends on the case if there's been a candidate name released or not. We didn't differentiate that in the statistics for you, but that does mean that the state police have done the snapshot in CODIS, pulled it out, and did all of their testing according to their validation, and we have completed training on those folks.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jill, I have a question as well. I just wondered, I think those statistics are really important for us to hear, so appreciate you giving us these updates. I wondered if data was tracked for any other, or were any other stats tracked? So for instance, do you or does the laboratory performing this search track things like when we do a familial search, we get a candidate list, a possible candidate list of 20 names, 100 names, and of those 20 times, a true relative appears X times. I'm sorry, I'm just sort of throwing things out. So I guess more technically oriented metrics or data points or what have you. That's one question. Then another question would be, and I suppose this is more in the hands of the law enforcement agency that is going to take this information, but I think it would be valuable to know once a lead is generated, then what happens. Obviously, we'll know if there's an arrest, but for instance, how many DNA samples were taken from potential relatives out in the world? How were they taken? Were they surreptitiously taken? Was consent asked for? Just sort of the logistics of how it's conducted, which again may be agency by agency, but I guess sort of more technical or data on technical aspects of the search, and then also data about, and I know there are not a lot of actual successful searches to base off of, but what happens once a candidate is released, if that makes sense, I hope.
Yeah, no, it totally does. So I'll start backwards with the law enforcement question. That is definitely something that they would have information on. They may or may not disclose that in some of their updates, which again, they're required to give us every 6 months once they've completed the training. So we do track in terms of the progress of the case, and they do submit details to us. Going back to the first part, when you ask about exact familial relationships, our office does not track something like that. We don't make that a requirement to disclose. However, I'm not sure if the state police, because they also have contact with law enforcement, if they would track that data.
Is someone from the state police available to ask this question, or could we do it in the future?
Tom, I believe Tom Leach is on. If he could raise his hand or press *3. Or maybe Ray.
You have been unmuted.
Hi, this is Dave Polakowski from the State Police Lab. Neither Ray nor Tom are available. They're out of state currently. So it might be best to ask that question at a later date.
Sure, thank you.
Any other questions regarding this item? All right, next we have our STR mix software issue. There's a letter dated June 23rd from the DNA subcommittee with regard to, at least as I read it, with regard to their conclusion after reviewing this issue. They did have a special meeting on June 16th to wrap up their discussion and consideration of this issue. It's my understanding from reading the materials that the committee did hear from all the laboratories in New York that utilize this software, and ultimately they were satisfied with the response from the laboratories and the software developer. Are there any comments or questions with regard to this issue?
Yes.
Cool.
Okay. I don't know if someone from ESR is available, or maybe someone from the labs could address this, or someone from the subcommittee. But I'm just having trouble understanding, and I want to make sure I understand this correctly. The answer, ESR's answer to number 3 of David Loftus's letter to this subcommittee. That would be page 150 of the commission materials. But the question is, given this issue with the HPD, that there's not 99% coverage of the Monte Carlo aspect of uncertainty, which is what was intended and desired when ESR, built this method to try to account for uncertainty. The question is, if the method had been working as intended and had full 99% coverage, would it be possible that inclusionary likelihood ratios would change to uninformative range? I know, for instance, OCME has an uninformative range for likelihood ratios from 0.001 to 1,000. So say if you had a likelihood ratio of 1,050, if the HPD, the Monte Carlo aspect of the HPD, had full 99% coverage and was operating the way the ESR originally intended it to, would that drive the reported number from 1,050 down to 990? It seems as if the answer from ESR is yes, it could. And just reading from page 150, right, they say the point estimate remains unchanged. It's only the lower bound that is affected. So those labs that report the HPD number or a unified LR, which incorporates that HPD number, would be affected, right? So it says the lower bound could move across the thresholds mentioned. So that would be moving from inclusionary to uninformative, inclusionary to exclusionary, and uninformative to exclusionary, all of which, right, it's apparent what kind of effect that could have on an actual case, right? That could make all the difference in a case, depending on the role of the DNA evidence. And then they go on to provide data in their answer and note that one of the largest changes was a factor of 1.7. Then after that, I understand ESR goes on to explain, well, look, we have these other measures we build into our program and reported results that account for other types of uncertainty. Relatedness, theta, population genetic model, also allele probability uncertainty, right? The frequency at which you see these DNA markers in the universe. But it seems clear that they haven't been able to test at least the allele probability together with this Monte Carlo uncertainty. They say on page 151, we don't know how to test these collectively, but still they express a confidence that overall, they're still above 99% coverage. And I'm just confused about that and their initial answer that yes, you can move ranges from inclusionary to exclusionary, inclusionary to uninformative, which has a huge impact on real cases. And I think would merit going back and looking at old cases that fell around a range, which I suppose would have to be empirically determined. But if it's close enough to one of these boundaries and could switch, if this method was truly performing as it should have, that's important. So I have this question, maybe it's best addressed to ESR or the subcommittee. I know the subcommittee reviewed this materials, but if it would actually have an effect on a reported result, I think more work needs to be done. But I wonder what others think.
I guess a couple of initial thoughts. First, the technical aspect of this is something that generally, I think we rely on the subcommittee for, because that's what they're there for, is to provide us with technical expertise. They've looked at this, they've given us their opinion. Now again, I'm obviously not a scientist. A lot of folks here know a lot more about this than I do, but it sounds to me like, what they were saying there and what you're saying is that they are being incredibly cautious in how they interpret mixtures and report results. And while I get being cautious has implications, I tend to think that it's a positive thing in this context. But, if there, I don't know if there's anyone here who wants to answer that question or not. I'm certainly not in a position to do it. And I think that's why we kicked it to the subcommittee to answer it.
The important thing to remember is that you're looking at a continuum.
Someone's trying to speak. Do we know? I think we better identify who it is first.
Yeah,
Oh,
Mike,
okay.
you're breaking up.
Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Not really. Try again. It's pretty broken.
How about now?
Perfect.
Sorry about that. More technical difficulties. So one of the things that I want to just mention, that there's that verbal scale that's being discussed when you in actuality have a continuum of numerical data, right? An LR where it's 99 times more likely or 101 times more likely still has a lot of information content. So in my opinion, even though it could push, you still have those LRs to go on to see how close they are to those ranges. In reading this, there's multiple levels of conservatism that the labs use. So my opinion is that I have a lot of confidence in the way the labs are handling this.
Do you think? Oh, I'm sorry. Go.
I was just going to say, to the extent you have questions for the subcommittee, they're not here. I don't think there's anything that would prevent you from, writing to them. I guess one of the issues I see is, I'm sure they were hoping that anyone who had questions or input would give it to them before that June meeting or at that June meeting. Because at some point they want to put this issue to bed. But if there's a question you have that you want to pose to them, I guess I'd say the clearest way to do it might be to put it in writing, bring it to the commission meeting in December, and we can vote as a commission as to whether or not we want to continue to put more questions to them or not.
Sure, that might be helpful, and I understand they have already put in, a fair amount of work on this, but we did get all these materials, which are extensive, some of which were previously available, but some of which were not, right? A couple of weeks ago, and it's also just trying to reconcile two statements in this document, as I had said. I also had a question about the wide interval issue that was separate from the HPD disclosure, but I'm happy to put that in a letter to the subcommittee. How do I do that? Do I CC all the commission members and it will get disseminated, or?
My suggestion would be put it in a letter to the commission, asking the commission, because I think the request to the subcommittee have to come from the commission.
Right.
So and Natasha's shaking her head, yes, I see. So my suggestion would be put it in a letter to the commission asking us to address this at the December meeting. And then, I just think it'd be easier if everyone can see exactly what the request is, have time to prepare for it. And then we can vote at the December meeting on whether or not we want to send that to the subcommittee and ask them for further clarification.
Okay.
Is that,
I did
Natasha,
also.
does that sound like a proper procedure?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Jessica, you can send it to OSS. That way we're not, conducting any meetings via email.
Okay.
Okay.
Send to OFS. Okay. I did have a couple additional questions for the labs about the documentation that they had provided to the subcommittee. Could I ask that now?
Sure.
Okay. I guess the first is for Suffolk County.
I don't know if we will have lab people specifically prepared to answer any questions. We didn't prep that. There may be some.
We do this, just, I didn't think of it, but that's a good point, Shelley. In fairness to the labs, maybe if you could just indicate in your correspondence, what labs it is that you have questions of, and just generally what the topics are so that they can prepare, and then we'll make sure and have, the right lab people available at the December meeting, so you can ask the questions and they're prepared to speak on them.
Sure. Yeah, no, I can put the questions in ready.
Mike, I had just, oh, sorry.
That's okay. I just wanted to ask Jessica, when you had mentioned earlier about something about more work needed to be done. So is it ESR that needs to do more work? Is it the subcommittee that needs to do more work? Is it the labs that need to do more work? Because I've been watching the subcommittee meetings and their discussions surrounding this, and I got the impression that they, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, and obviously I don't have notes written down, but I didn't get the impression that they were overly concerned with what they were hearing and what they were, as they were learning what ESR was telling them, and also listening to what the labs did in response to the notification, they seemed to think that the labs responded well to what they were informed by ESR. So I just wanted to put that out there, and I can understand that, because we did get some more information in this latest book, that more questions are being elicited. But I think that if you want more information in your letter, maybe you need to say, I need this from ESR, but I don't need this from the subcommittee. Or if you need something from everybody, maybe you can put it from everybody so we know what kind of more information you'd like to get.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's a helpful suggestion. I will do exactly that. And I did share the same assessment that you had about the subcommittee's evaluation of the situation and the New York State lab response, that there was satisfaction concerning ESR and the lab's response. But I have some additional concerns about that, which I'll put in the letter. And I think that's a great idea to, ask lab specific questions, ESR, and make clear who I'm asking what to.
I think that'd be helpful. Thanks. Go ahead.
It's a lot and it's not easy. It's a lot.
I do just want to mention some of the issues you brought up are actually also covered in peer-reviewed publications. Some referenced in the documents and others that are not.
Yeah, I've looked at those as best as I can, but I still have to. Yeah, I still feel unsatisfied about a couple basic questions, but no, I appreciate there's been those 2 unpublished papers specifically addressing this issue, as well as peer-reviewed publications addressing sort of larger StarMix validation issues. nevertheless, the questions remain.
So if I could just chime in with one more question, as you're thinking about what to send over to the subcommittee. In ESR's response to Mr. Loftus's letter, there was a question about what versions of StarMix were affected, and the answer was that it was all versions employing the Monte Carlo part of the HPD, which encompasses version 2.3 and onwards. My question is whether, when the initial developmental validation and approval was given by the DNA subcommittee, if it was of a prior version. I believe it may have been. And if that's the case, if the subcommittee would undertake reviewing the version that has the Monte Carlo HPD method, because that does seem like a significant change. So I would just raise that as you're going forward with the subcommittee and further questions.
Thank you. Anything else on this item? All right, so this will be on our December agenda as well. Next, we have an update with regard to investigative genetic genealogy. So I don't know, Natasha, is there anything you wanted to provide to the commission to start out with regard to jurisdiction?
I will say this. I mean, I'd say it's a little premature right now, only because NYPD hasn't really, I don't think they've done it yet. I think they're considering doing this, so I don't really know the exact process, what's going to be involved. But I will say this, and generally, yes and no, and I'll tell you why. We're dealing with a public database. However, you have a public lab who is basically conducting familial searching with this public database. And the commission has jurisdiction over public labs. And we also have the authority to approve forensic methodologies conducted by these public labs. And basically, that's what IGG is. NYPD says that they're not doing any testing, they're not doing any analysis. However, someone is doing it for them. They're outsourcing. And this private lab is doing the work, but the DNA is coming from somewhere. So the DNA is coming from NYPD. They're giving it to this private lab. They're doing the work, giving them these SNPs to upload into this public database. After that point, if there is like a match, NYPD must, continue on and do additional research, taking whatever they do, getting additional DNA, testing that DNA, and uploading it into CODIS to get what they're looking for. So they are doing some testing, whether it's via the outsourcing or on the other end where they're doing it themselves. As an end result, there is testing going on with this. So I think in that respect, yes, we could possibly have jurisdiction. But again, without knowing the details of it, I can't really give you a definitive answer.
Yeah, and oh, go ahead.
There's also a piece of proposed bill in the legislature right now that would require explicit consent from the individuals whose profile is in the public database for use in any kind of comparison for forensic crime scene purposes. That would change the playing field for doing this, because somebody like NYPD could not go to the public database unless the public database had gotten explicit written consent to access the individual profiles. It would no longer be a mega database, because it would be a sequestered database depending on whether the individual would allow participation in investigative genealogy. It may be unique it's probably unique to New York. It's probably, whether it would pass, who knows, but it has to do with privacy and access, and nothing to do with commission jurisdiction. And
I think right now, some people they opt in, like they're aware that their DNA might be used for law enforcement. They're not aware to the extent of it. They don't know what it's being used like for familial searching or this in genealogy searching. So
Right.
they're not completely.
There's no explicit consent that says this is what it means. So.
No, thank you for that. And, certainly if that passes, that would change the conversation. Just thinking about what Natasha said, and kind of going back to my DA days and reading court decisions, it does seem like, we're being asked at this point to decide a case without having a case in front of us. And that, I think, puts us at a real disadvantage. I think our normal process is if someone wants to use a technology or a methodology, they come before us, and or the subcommittee and tell us exactly what it is they want to do. And then we, make decisions with that information in front of us. And I think that's probably what you were getting at in the first part of your response. So, my inclination would be that we, at least my recollection is that we said if anyone wanted to do this, they had to come before the commission, let the commission know what they wanted to do. And I personally think that's the best course of action to continue is, to wait until someone says we want to use it and tell us what it is they want to do with it, and then we can, have all the facts in front of us to make a better decision. I don't know how other folks feel about that.
Yeah, I would just, I assume that NYPD is not on the line today, but to Natasha's question of not knowing what they plan to do or where they plan to do it, it seems to me that that Director Kastronakis or someone else should come to the next meeting and be able to explain that. But then I just had another small question, which is if we know the bill number of the proposed bill that's pending related to the explicit consent.
I didn't write the bill number down. Quick search at Ledge Info bill under genetics and it'll come up.
I'll do that. Thank you.
My law students found it. I didn't.
Is it a state bill or federal?
It's a state bill, both in the Assembly and the Senate.
Where are we with NYPD in terms of their communication? Have they given us anything else in terms of their intent to use this? Since
I believe that they did speak at the subcommittee meeting.
Right, and they provided the letter, which again is very general. They were just saying, IgG is a 3-part process. There's the, analysis stage, there's the bioinformatics stage, and then there's the searching investigative part of it, which they'll be doing. But then again, like I said, what does that mean? Without them actually explaining it, it's hard to make any, decisions on it.
So yes, one suggestion would be write back to them and tell them if they intend to move forward with this, that we want them to give a much more detailed presentation at the December commission meeting on exactly what it is they intend to do, and then the commission can vote at that point on how we want to handle it, whether or not we think we have oversight, and if so, what we want to do with it. Is everyone all right with that, or any other suggestions? All right, do we need a vote on that, Natasha, or can we just write them?
Yes, a vote, please.
All right. Is everyone all right with that course of action? I vote yes. Ann?
Yes.
Jill? I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Jill, I didn't. Okay, thanks.
Sorry, yes.
Lydia?
Yes.
Jessica?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
Judge?
Yes.
And Bill?
Yes.
All right, thank you. All right. So I think that completes old business. For new business, the first item we have is a letter from August 12th regarding a draft report, as I understand it, from NIST about DNA mixture interpretation. And I think the draft report was entitled DNA Mixture Interpretation, a Scientific Foundation Review. DNA Subcommittee, as I understand it, discussed this at their last meeting, but indicated it was premature to either discuss it in detail or take any action on it since it was a draft. It was out for public comment. As I understand it, the public comment period ended August 23rd. And as I understand it, NIST intends to review the public comments and then at some point in the future issue a final, either final report or final draft. So personally, I don't think we should be doing anything based off of a draft report. I think if we're going to issue a final report, we should certainly be evaluating that. But if anyone has any comments, happy to entertain them.
I would just note, Mike, that they appear to be far more cautious about the interpretation of mixtures and their value than the DNA subcommittee seems to be in looking at the current software process.
Yeah, I think that would be a fair statement based on the draft.
Just to dovetail on Ann's observation, I agree, and I think that's alarming, right? I understand this is a draft report, but I would doubt seriously that their conclusion that there's not enough publicly available information for them to determine the reliability of PG systems is going to change. But given the fact that this PG is used on thousands of cases, thousands of New Yorkers cases and prosecutions every year, this is troubling, particularly in light of New York is lucky to have the DNA subcommittee, but the DNA subcommittee, as I think Terry's question brought up earlier, has only reviewed one validation, and we're not sure if it's even the current iteration of StarMix being used in New York. And I think just one other major point, I think we're suffering from a lack of data on the use of PG, and I wonder if that's a role that the commission might be able to take. So for instance, Dr. Dooley has familial search statistics that inform the commission about how often it's being used and to what end, and that's important to evaluate the efficacy of the technique. But we don't have information about probabilistic genotyping that is public. So for instance, one of the issues underscored in the NIST report is the use of PG on touch samples, right? Samples that have been believed to have been handled, like firearms, knife handles, etc. And that's where often the most complex mixtures lie. I think it would benefit the commission's review of both the final NIST report, the subcommittee's review of it, and just our task of overseeing quality in forensic DNA in New York, if we knew how it was being used. So for instance, metrics like how many cases is PG being used on? What versions? How many of them are mixtures? How many single source? How many are 3-person mixtures, 4-person mixtures? What's the relative quantity of DNA? Factors that NIST obviously identified, or factors that the DNA subcommittee would find important. I just think given the importance that NIST placed on how this stuff is being used in the field, and we know so little about that except for I have experience as a defender, but it's localized to OCME. I think we need that data desperately. I don't know what others think.
I do want to point out that the open comment period is, serving as a peer review. And I am aware of many groups that are responding to this. One thing it discounts, I don't want to say discounts, it doesn't mention directly, is the amount of rigor and effort put into the validations by the laboratories. These validations are reviewed based on what I recall during accreditation as well. And I'm fairly certain that these validations are also made available by many labs upon request.
Any other comments or thoughts?
Yeah, Mike is correct. And I think that one of the things the DNA subcommittee is going to find, which I found, was that there's a lot of misleading information in this draft about the publicly available data regarding the efficacy of PG. So I don't think it's productive to continue to discuss it now, but I think we certainly should wait for the DNA subcommittee report and discuss it further when they make a comment.
I think the problem, though, is that this is still, it's a serious red flag, the NIST Foundation review, and this technique, this method is being used on thousands of people, predominantly poor people, predominantly people of color, Late Society's clients. And it doesn't seem to make sense to barrel forward until we get more information when there's such a huge red flag. And by the way, this isn't coming out of the blue, right? There was the PCAST report from a few years ago, which suffered a lot of the same criticism, but we have a trend here. Whenever there's a group of independent scientists, we have NIST, the federal government, and then the PCAST report examining the state of PG, there are serious issues and its use raised. So at what point do things stop so that there can be an adequate assessment of whether this stuff is reliable or whether thousands of people are being prosecuted with an unreliable technique? I don't think you can put on blinders and say, well, let's just see how it works out. They're saying we don't know if this is reliable, yet people are going to jail.
I don't think anybody said that, Jessica. I think you're misconstruing what both Mike and Bill said. I don't think anyone said, let's just see how it works out. I think the suggestion was that there's a draft report issued and that there was a public comment period and there were significant public comments they're aware of that were submitted. And, it wasn't just, let's see how it works out. It was, let's see what the final report says before we go, taking any significant action.
But just to sort of amplify what Ms. Goldthwait said, I think that there's cross conversations happening. There was a criticism from NIST that there wasn't enough publicly available data to make the assessment. And then the response from a lot of folks has been, well, there is a lot of publicly available data. That's fine, give the publicly available data, but then NIST has to make the assessment. And so right now we're in a position where the draft report says we don't have enough to make an assessment. And I think the barreling forward point is correct. It's that there's a need for an assessment. The NIST at the time didn't have enough data. They'd like more data. If more data comes in, that's wonderful. But what happens until that data is reviewed? And I think Ms. Goldthwait's point is the right one, which is until that additional data is reviewed, the areas of concern should be paused, right? And I don't think that's quite as controversial as it sounds. It's where do you balance these interests? Do you keep using a method that PCAST and now NIST has said needs more review, or do you wait until that review happens? And so I don't, you know, just to amplify and support what she said, I don't think that it's a mistake of anything that's happening.
It was a misstatement of what Mike and Bill said. But in any event, does anyone else have any comments, or does
Yeah,
anyone
sorry,
have
I
any
wasn't
motions they
even-
want to make?
Sorry, I wasn't even commenting as much on Bill and Mike, so I apologize if that's how it came across, but more just sort of kicking the can down the road. Just, I mean, I agree, we have to see what the final report says, but it's, again, what we do in the meantime, particularly in light that there are criticisms coming from other corners that are very serious, from independent scientists. But yet this is being used to deprive people of their liberty. So my sense is,
What are you proposing that we do at this point?
I mean, I think the only appropriate action is to place a moratorium on the use of PG in New York State for complex DNA mixtures. That would not stop all DNA testing. There are other methods that have been validated or used, but it would stop the use of PG on the most complex samples that there are these huge red flags about.
All right, are you making that motion?
Yes, I'm making
Right,
that
is there-
motion, and I vote yes.
Is there a second? All right, without a second, we don't even get to a vote.
Get to a vote.
I
have another
would ask,
suggestion.
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I understand the subcommittee is saying they want to wait for the final report, but two things. One, in the meantime, what about the labs sending their PG validations to the subcommittee for review, which hasn't happened? I know Erie's, I think, was reviewed, but other labs have not had, as I understand, their PG validations reviewed. So that would be one step that could start now. And the other step would be this data collection. Can the commission request that labs turn over data about how this method is being used? I mean, there's no reason to wait for at least those things until the draft report.
Any other comment or discussion on those two items? All right, are you making a motion with regard to those two?
I should do them separately, right?
Probably, yeah.
Okay, so I guess the first motion would be the commission will require any lab using probabilistic genotyping to provide the commission, the DNA subcommittee, with statistics on its use to be determined by the DNA subcommittee and commission. What data points?
All right, do we have a second for that?
Could I ask a question?
Go.
I'm a little,
Absolutely.
yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a little confused, Jessica, about the motion.
Mm-hmm.
Are you asking that labs make their validation studies on probabilistic genotyping available to the DNA subcommittee?
So that was not the motion. Yes, that is one of the two. The one I just, Commissioner Green just asked for the second for is just about data collection. But yes, but my first, I guess the first motion I'm putting forth is whether the commission should require labs to provide data on the use of probabilistic genotyping. Don't we need to know how it's being used? How do we successfully regulate the use of forensic DNA and probabilistic genotyping without actually knowing how it's being used?
Well, these are determinations, as you well know, that are usually made in court. But if your motion is to make validation studies by the various labs throughout New York State available to the DNA subcommittee, I'll join in that. But I'm just not clear on the language of what your first motion is.
Can I jump in for a second, Jessica and Bill? When you say how the labs use it, wouldn't the approach be delineated in their standard operating procedures? Is that what you're talking about? Because that would be what the analysts would use to apply probabilistic genotyping to results that they're getting. So if we were to ask for a copy of their SOP, because that's different than data. So if, I wouldn't object to something saying, can we have a copy of their SOP that describes the approach that each lab takes in, needing to use PG? I think that could be useful. OCME has their SOP on a public facing website, but I don't believe any of the other New York State labs do. So asking for that, I don't think is unreasonable.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point of clarification, and I agree. That would be, along with validation, that would be very useful. So right, I understand SOPs convey to the analysts the limits of the technique that have been established through internal validation. So yes, I think that's it's critical. I think also critical, though, is to understand how it's actually being used. I mean, we can look back at the StarMix HPD disclosure and look at ESR's own language about how the wide interval HPD issue, for instance, was not discovered in developmental validation, but only through use. So this does happen, right? Developmental validation and internal validation can't foresee every circumstance. So I think it's important just to get a sense of how this method is actually getting used, which is different than SOPs. SOPs should establish the limits, but how many samples are touch samples? How many are 4-person mixture? I see that, I think it's, and I apologize if I get this wrong, but maybe it's Erie, maybe it's Suffolk that's doing 5-person mixtures. What are labs doing? Where are they setting these limits? And then how many 5-person mixtures are coming into the lab from touch samples, right? Because those are exactly the types of samples that NIST are identifying as perhaps the most difficult. So it's literally just understanding what is out there in the state of New York, what is being done. But I agree with both Lydia and Bill about requiring both the validation studies and the SOPs. And I agree that OCME putting the SOPs on its public-facing website is critical and a real benefit. And I would encourage the other labs in New York State to do that. But I hope that clears up a little about what I meant by data and tracking data. But I do agree SOPs are critical as well.
Let's see if we can address this in parts here. So first, listening to what everyone says, at least part of the conversation seems to be, should laboratories who are using this method provide their SOPs and their validation study to the DNA subcommittee? I think between Lydia and Bill and Jessica, that was at least part of what was discussed. Is that fair?
Yes. Can they be made available to us as well? Would that change?
Yeah, I'd have to look at the process, but I think generally, if it's made available to the subcommittee, they review it and make a recommendation to us. I think generally the materials that they use have then been made available to the commission. I'm trying to remember historically. I think there have been times when things have been made available for the commission to inspect without actually giving them out to the commission. Whether this falls into that situation or not, I don't know. But one way or another, we're ultimately asked to pass on a determination that the subcommittee has made. I would think that we would have to have some ability to review the underlying material. So is there a motion then to require laboratories using this methodology to provide their SOPs and the validation study to the DNA subcommittee initially.
Yes.
All right, is there a second for that?
I'll second.
All right, any discussion? All right, Ann? Oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I've got
Sorry.
either a comment or a discussion.
I had a question, which was, what is the expectation from the subcommittee, though, if we're asking the laboratories to submit their validations and their SOPs, what are we tasking them with doing other than just looking at them? I don't see there's an action for them to follow through on.
So I think that's a good point. You know, and two thoughts come to mind. One is that at some point, NIST is going to issue a final report, and in evaluating that final report, I think it would be helpful for the DNA subcommittee to have this information. And I can't imagine we wouldn't ask the DNA subcommittee to review any final report that is issued. So I think, you know, this would just expedite that review when it happens. So I guess that, to me, that would be the major point of doing this at this time.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify, yeah, so that way, if they ask us, what are we doing with these, we can kind of let them know what the expectation was on the part of the commission. So thank you.
All right. Any other questions before we vote?
Yeah, this is to provide data that has already been generated, right? This is not putting any additional burden on the laboratories who are stretched
Correct.
pretty thin as it is.
I think Jessica has a second point she wants to raise, and I've tried to separate them. So this one is for existing standard operating procedures and existing validation studies that laboratories who are using this method have.
To make available to the DNA subcommittee if the DNA subcommittee requests them.
No.
I guess
To
I would just say
require
make it
submission.
available to them so that the DNA subcommittee has it when they get the final NIST report and have to evaluate it against what's happening in New York.
All right.
Any other questions? All right, Ann?
Yes.
Jill?
Yes.
Lydia?
Yes.
Jessica?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
Judge?
Yes.
Bill?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Now, if I understood you correctly, Jessica, you had an additional request looking for the labs to, you know, generate and provide additional data around this methodology. I'm not exactly clear on the additional data, but if you want to make a motion in that regard, you know, by all means.
Yeah.
It'd help. I think it would certainly help me if you could spell out a little clearer what it is you want the labs to do.
Okay. I mean, my initial thought was I guess the type of data that would be important could be determined by the commission or the subcommittee. But if I had to drill down, I think in order for the commission to do its job to get a sense of how this method is being used in New York State, I would make a motion to require labs to issue to the commission a report of how many mixtures per month are analyzed, the number of contributors in those mixtures, the template amount, the mixture ratio, how many of those mixtures are believed to be from touch samples, how many have elimination samples sent along with them, and then how many that are interpreted are deemed suitable for comparison, and how many, I suppose it'd be useful, how many of those are inclusionary versus exclusionary. And sorry, so there's often, I just want to be clear, how many mixtures are suitable for interpretation, and also how many mixtures of those that are suitable for interpretation in the first instance are then suitable for comparison. I guess the two steps.
Would you consider limiting that request to some time frame? You know,
Sure.
1 month, 3 months, most recent month? I mean, because
Yeah,
that could
sure.
be a huge job for a lab, or a very small job, I don't know.
No, that's a fair point. Why not three months? So let's see, what is, I suppose this is sort of arbitrary about the 3 months I'm picking, and also mindful that the pandemic has obviously changed how casework is being handled necessarily.
Well,
sorry,
cases completed
please, any suggestions?
cases completed in the third quarter of 2021. That would
Sounds
be
good.
July,
Okay.
August, and September, right?
Okay.
Mike, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, I feel like this is a lot to ask labs to track this data in addition to everything else they track. And in some cases, you're not going to get an apples to apples comparison because the labs have different SOPs, which are all validated. So in addition to that, there are, circumstances where labs, are given information, they think it's touch, or they classify it one way. So I'm not sure how effective this would be, and I'm not sure what questions this would answer. SOPs certainly would show how the labs are using the PG system that they validated. And to me, that's absolutely the most important point. We'll find in the SOPs, the basis of their validation, right? What are their cutoffs, their limits of detection, how many contributors, that the sample might be made of or composed of to enter into this. But I think that there's a nebulous nature to this request. That's just my opinion.
Fair enough. Is there any suggestion, Mike, for drilling down maybe any data points you think would be, more helpful? I think those would be helpful in sort of understanding the level of complexity that is being tackled by labs with this method, which is, again, one of the concerns in the NIST report. But if you have any suggestions about different data points or something more concrete.
My suggestion would be to evaluate the SOPs prior to any requests for data collection to see if there's any good answers there. There's too many. I think there's too many questions, and one is what is complex. Everyone has a different definition. I think if we start with the SOPs, I believe that will take us or the subcommittee very far in answering some of the concerns. I think it would be difficult to ask labs to compile this type of data.
Sure, and I think Bill raised a point about labs being stretched thin, certainly in the pandemic. I understand that. Would it be possible for us to ask labs if they already track some of this information? I have a feeling they may already do it, and we just don't have the data. Maybe I'm wrong. But if they're already tracking it, then maybe it won't be difficult at all.
My understanding, and I wish we had a forensic crime laboratory director at this meeting, but my understanding is that it would not be simple to track, and it might even have to be done manually. And I think it's in anticipation of a final NIST report, which we haven't seen yet. So I think that as it is now, I'm voting no, but I would prefer to discuss it with one of our forensic laboratory directors in the discussion.
Lydia, can you shed any light on that from the lab perspective?
Yes. Bill, I guess you forgot I'm one of those now.
No, I just meant you hadn't spoken yet, Lydia. I was,
Oh,
I was
no,
trying to chide you into speaking.
Oh, no, that's all right. Yeah, I would agree with what you said, that, you know, it is difficult to track, and we, you know, we're asked to track a lot of stuff. And each laboratory has different needs based on their particular, you know, customers that we serve. And obviously, I think everyone knows I switched from New York City to Westchester County, and that's been quite a difference in, you know, kind of mind blown. It's like, wow, okay, this is really different. Didn't think it was going to be that different. And the reason why, and this may not be a full answer to Bill's question, but I will say that it's definitely, and I want to confirm what Mike said about it's not going to be apples to apples. So if we were to at least start off with the SOPs, we can see what's common and then where things veer off. Yes, Jessica, I hear what you're saying, that maybe some labs might be tracking something and keeping track of something, but I don't know what that would be. So it would be, and again, I think it would be very disparate based on the different communities that we serve and who, you know, who we might answer to on a local level. So I understand where you're coming from, but I would, with the list of things that you were delineating, you know, my mind was saying, I don't, you know, where am I going to get that from? Where am I going to get that from? Who, you know, we all have different, well, I think most of the state have the BEAST, but I don't know as a limb system, but I don't think New York City has a different limb system. It's a lot. It really is a lot. So I understand the reason why you would like this information, but if we can have it in a little more, and and to me, this is not trying to delay anything, and I really do understand where you're coming from with this, but I don't think it's a bad place to start by looking at the SOPs, because it might answer some of your questions. You talked about 5-person mixtures. I don't know if any labs in New York State are doing 5-person mixtures, or even maybe 4-person mixtures, you know, so maybe if you can see that, okay, they're all doing this and I'm not worried about that, and then see where there are things where more scrutiny is, you know, it's reasonable to ask for that further information based on the SOPs. So that's what I have to say about that.
Thank you. Judge, you've been trying to weigh in for a while now.
I'm not a scientist, but I'm not clear about if we get this information, what we do with it. What do we intend to do with it?
Judge, so I think, you know, if we get this information, it will give us the information we need to determine how this is actually being used in the field. So there's apples to apples comparison, which there's some concern it wouldn't be lab to lab comparison. But one type of comparison it would be useful for is comparing actual use of the program in real world casework samples to what has been validated, which I think was a point stressed by NIST. And I don't think that point is going to change in between the draft and the final report. I'm sorry.
I'm still, maybe you can explain it to me so I understand it better, but if we get this sort of raw statistical information before the report is complete, what happens with it? Does it now become discoverable, or was it discoverable before? It's now, these are public, by the time we have our next meeting, or a meeting in which this is discussed, this information is public, it's foilable. Where do we go with this? How how do we use this to evaluate the reporter? Or maybe this will all be in the report anyway. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure exactly, not sure at all what the report will contain. So I just like to understand it a little bit better.
Right, right. No, I think that's a good question, and I can work on coming up with a better answer. But I think, for instance, just to throw out one example, say labs have the 4 labs in New York have all validated, it doesn't matter. Say one lab in New York has validated 4 or 5 person mixtures of the use of star mix, which I actually think one of the labs did based on the lab report we received, but I could be mistaken, but say it's true. And then we get a copy, as Lydia rightly suggested, and Bill, that we get their standard operating procedures, and they say you can interpret 5-person mixtures because it's been validated. And the subcommittee evaluates the validation and sees that 5-person mixtures were tested. Maybe, and I'm happy to be corrected by a scientist, but if, say, 50% of the casework coming into a lab is 5-person mixtures with no elimination samples, for instance, like a homeowner in a burglary case, and the validation is only tested 2 5-person mixtures, maybe the subcommittee or maybe we are going to say that that's not sufficient to establish the reliability of the technique on what I think is widely accepted to be the most challenging types of samples out there. And I think it also might give some information.
Wouldn't that be something for the DNA? I don't mean to interrupt, but it's sort of a dialogue.
It's helpful.
Wouldn't that be something for the DNA subcommittee to tell us about?
On the first instance, I think yes. I think they would make the scientific decisions about the sufficiency of the validation, but then we're charged with either sending it back to the subcommittee or deeming it a sufficient review. So I think we still have responsibility in that respect. But yes, I agree. It would be a scientific decision by the subcommittee. But I think one other example perhaps is the use of elimination samples, meaning a person you believe had contact with an item that you're then testing. The most obvious example is a police officer who collected an item at the scene. I've had maybe one case in New York City where I got elimination samples from police officers who, by the way, were ruled out as contributors to this mail donor A that was detected on an item. Do other labs collect elimination samples from the police officers that actually handle evidence? Do they not? Does that assist in interpretation? Because I think that could then inform policy decisions about whether it should be required for law enforcement to give samples. And I know that's a whole issue, but so I think it would inform both the scientific review being done by the DNA subcommittee as well as policy decisions that are also more in our realm. But I think that's a good question, Judge, and I'm happy to do some more thinking and even put it in a letter to the subcommittee if I'm allowed to do that. I mean, the commission if I'm allowed to do that.
I would like to have more concrete information about what we intend to do with this statistics, this information, before we really, make a decision as to demanding it from the labs myself.
Okay.
So if I can make a suggestion, Jessica,
yes,
my
please.
sense is that if you make a motion now, it's not going to pass, because I think first of all, you need either every vote or almost every vote for it to pass. We have just voted to require labs to provide the SOPs and the validation studies. If you think there's something more that's needed, I'd suggest that you put something together in writing and let the commission consider it in the December meeting. Frankly, I very much agree with some of the comments Mike and Lydia made. In addition, I think that, I hope that some of this would be, that the final report would shed some light on some of this as well. So maybe by the December meeting, we'll have more clarity as well. So if that's acceptable, I'd ask that we take that course.
No, I think that's a good idea. I think and Lydia, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the suggestions was to examine the SOPs to get a sense of the type of information that would be helpful. So with that in mind, I know the motion passed to send SOPs and validation to the subcommittee. But in light of Lydia's comment, is it possible we at least get, I mean, OCME is public, but is it possible we get the SOPs for the other, I think, 3 labs that are using PG in the state? I think it'll help this further.
Natasha or Shelley, do you see any issue providing the, once the SOPs come to the DNA subcommittee, do you see any issue providing them to the commission members?
I don't see an issue.
All right, no, I think that's fine then.
Great, thanks.
All right, thank you, everyone. I appreciate the discussion here. And again, this will be on the December agenda as well, I'm sure, with the final, assuming the final report comes out.
And sorry,
Next
just before we
oh,
close this,
sure.
I'm sorry, just before we close this out, just
no problem.
a procedural question going back to the very beginning to the motion that Ms. Goldthwait made concerning the moratorium that didn't carry. We do only have one voting defense seat, but is it, I assume that I'm not able to even second the motion.
No.
Okay.
No.
I would have.
And again, not, just so that no one's under, well, never mind. I'll just leave it at that. Okay, thank you. All right, next we have, for informational purposes, effective September 1 of this year, there were amendments to the Executive Law, Article 49B, Section 995. It was part of the budget that passed this year. And that amended that section to remove the law enforcement exemption for latent print examination. If I remember correctly, I believe the commission had voted in the past to recommend that the legislature take that action, but in any event, it's been taken. I believe if I read it correctly, there is a 5-year window for compliance. DCJS did send communication to all law enforcement agencies in the state, notifying them of these amendments. Also notifying them that we do have a latent print, an accredited latent print laboratory at DCJS that has capacity in the event, entities who are doing this themselves need or want an accredited laboratory to help with the work. So this is on for informational purposes, but I think Jill wanted to add to this a discussion with regard to accreditation standards that might be relevant, given this transition to latent print work being done in an accredited environment. So Jill?
Yeah, so within our regs, we specifically state in the definitions that ANAB refers to accreditation requirements that are contained in ISO 17025. And 17025 are standards that are very frequently used for analytical or instrumental-based forensic science laboratories. Also, there is the option for ISO 17020 out there, which the NYPD Latent Lab recently achieved their accreditation to. And those set of standards are typically used in those more comparative sciences because they're not doing, what is the word I want to use? Like they don't have uncertainty of measurement. I'm just trying to think of all the different things, but typically you would use 17020 for more of the comparison type sciences. At this point, the way it's written, it currently would be excluded for it to fall under the purview of the commission. So I would propose that we make an amendment to that to add the ISO 17020 criteria in the event that any of the latent labs would like to pursue that accreditation.
which would seem a reasonable accommodation to the kind of entities, if any of them.
They would choose to do so, yes.
So that would require a regulation change.
It would, and so we could draft up the documents and have that for our December meeting and take a vote on that if that.
And by then you might have heard back from some of these entities and.
So we have heard from some already. In the letter that DCJS released, we also said that if they had any accreditation questions, to reach out to the Office of Forensic Services. And we have had some outreach on that. And so with that, you know, there are options that they can take. Obviously, ISO 17025 is one of them, clearly written, but ISO 17020 is a set of criteria that would also be acceptable for latent print discipline. So.
Good. As long as we're on legislative amendments again, there are 2 pending bills in the legislature that would make major amendments to 995. One, expanding the size of the commission by adding 2 additional members, and also creating this new Integrity of Criminal Justice Commission. But it also makes major changes to DNA sample retention, asking the commission to undertake a study and produce a report, redefines designated offender to expand those whose DNA would go into the database. It's bill number S3393. We should at least put it on the list of something to watch. I don't know what will happen with it. The other one redefines a forensic laboratory. I don't think it's a critical redefinition because it would include laboratories that analyze sexual offense evidence, and I thought we would already be including those since it's primarily DNA testing of rape kits. But it also adds a section that would require the evidence analysis to be entered into the state database, identification database, and to inform the victim that the analysis had been done and that the data had been entered and whether or not any matches had been made. And it specifies a 10-day submission time for rape kits to the laboratory and a 3-month testing time, or all untested rape kits have to be reported to the Office of Forensic Sciences. So it expands the roles. And that's Senate number 4949, another one that should be watched. They sneak up on us, Mike.
There's a lot of bills pending out there. Anyone have any comments with regard to the 17020 versus 025?
I think it's a good idea to offer them that option if it fits better.
Perhaps the regulation should state, though, that we're offering that option for latent print analysis.
Right.
Or you don't want to offer it for anything else, do you?
I mean, I would also see digital laboratory or crime scene.
Okay.
They can also fall under that.
Yeah, but it ought to be limited to those comparison categories rather than opening it up to everybody.
Which I think innately it is just based on the criteria. So based on the differences between the two, 17025 and 17020. And just speaking from when I was the latent print lab director, there are a lot of, there's 17025 here at DCJS, and there are a lot of criteria that you would just select not applicable to. So rather than do that, it would be more tailored to.
And I also found the other bill that you mentioned earlier.
Oh, thank you.
It's Assembly Bill 3867, and it would prevent genealogy firms from sharing genetic information of individuals with law enforcement without a signed waiver.
Thank you. I think I had asked about that one. I just had a question going back, sorry, to the Senate bill. That's essentially what that would do is amend essentially confidentiality and allow people who the DA's office has determined is a complainant in a sexual assault case to know whether a match has been generated, right? But it wouldn't actually release anyone's genetic data.
No, it would just, you have to just tell them that a match has been made.
I believe that just would be more specific than what the DOH or what is the victim's rights statement says, that they are allowed, they have the right to know.
Well, that has to do with the consent that's collected, which is totally not relevant.
But they also have the right to know what step of the process it's in, so it does state
that it's been submitted, and yeah.
So back to the issue at hand, it sounds like, Jill, that and Natasha, we should draft proposed regulations around the use of 17020 standard with regard to certain disciplines for the commission to consider at the December meeting.
Yep.
All right, that concludes our new business. The next item and last item on the open agenda is laboratory disclosures. The first one we have is the Erie County Central Police Services Lab. There's an email dated August 26th and another one dated August 30th. The August 26th one, as I read it, was the initial notification of non-conformance, and the next one was the NAB acknowledgement. As I read it, it was initial notification of a non-conformance regarding a DNA reporting error. The report was issued with an incorrect conclusion. The error was noticed by the assistant DA when reviewing. There were at least two different reports at issue here, report 4 and report 5. As I understand it, the lab is still conducting their investigation. Any questions or comments with regard to this? All right, we'll obviously carry this on the agenda for further information from the lab on their investigation. Next, we have the Erie County Medical Examiner's Office Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. This one, as I read it, there's an email dated June 8th of this year with regard to a proficiency test non-conformance with potential effects on casework. There's an email chain after that with regard to both follow-up and closure. It's my reading that the lab noted a non-conformance on an opiate proficiency test, suspended casework while they did the investigation. As I read it, they determined that the instrument an issue in the universe of affected case, where they determined the instrumental issue and the universe of affected casework. 2 reports were reissued, and then the investigation was documented in the case files with regard to those 2 cases. It looks from my review like the lab did make some procedural changes, and the lab considers the event closed. My reading at least indicates ABFT reviewed the documentation provided from the lab and determined that the outcome was satisfactory. I believe Christine Giffen is available if there are questions. Does anyone have questions or comments with regard to this issue? All right,
I just have a, sorry, I just have a quick question. It's just, if I read it correctly, it seemed that the instrument identified from the lab, there was a window of a month, but I could be mistaken about this. So does that mean there are only 2 of the particular opiate cases that were analyzed on the instrument during the month time, or I just wanted to make sure I understood.
Yeah, can we get Christine on the phone?
Go ahead, Christine.
Hi, this is Christine. Can I help you?
Hi, Christine. Just a question to make sure I understand. When you investigated the cause of this, you identified a particular instrument, and if I understand this right, there seemed to be a month span of time in which the problematic instrument or whatever was working, and you identified the cases that were impacted, and it was 2 cases that had to have reissued reports. Is that only because there were a couple of cases run during that month, or am I wrong about the time period there? Or
No, what happened is we analyzed 10% of all the cases that were run and saw no discrepancies in those results. So when we realized that we could report off the original injection, that was when we found those 2 cases would have caused different results. So it was more cases, but we did a retroactive analysis and verified that they were acceptable.
okay, the sampling, your 10% came out okay. Is that what you mean? Okay.
Yes.
And I see that you sent it to the DA's office. Do you also simultaneously put up a notice on, do you notify the defense attorneys as well?
I just basically mention it to the district attorney's office. I don't have any way to know which cases are, which defense attorneys are handling which cases. So I leave it up to the prosecution.
Yeah, I think that practice is shared by other labs in the state. Do you have pre-trials with the defense?
If they request them, we're happy to, but and once in a while I have had them reach out to me, but very rarely do they.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments with regard to this item?
Yeah, sorry, just to follow up on the point of disclosure. Do you have contact for your county's assigned counsel provider, and would it be possible to loop them into your regular notifications when things like this come up?
I'm unaware of that, but I would be happy to do such a thing if I had that information. Absolutely.
Perhaps offline, Ms. Goldthwait and I could help connect you in that way.
Thank you. I would appreciate that.
Thank you. Next, we have the New York State Police Crime Lab. As I read this, there's 2 non-conformances at issue here. The first has to do with inaccurate transfer of data on a controlled substance case. As I read it, the error was identified, an amended report was issued, and that the lab is currently conducting a root cause analysis. ANAB has been notified and acknowledged receipt of the notification. The second one, as I read it, is the closure of a serology nonconformance. This was on our agenda at the June Commission meeting. As I read it, the materials indicate a risk analysis was completed. The lab is indicating that it determined it was not unexpected that a single sperm head could be overlooked microscopically, and that the downstream procedures would remain unaffected. So they concluded basically the changes were not deemed necessary, at least as I read it, and that the lab considers this event closed. So are there any questions? And I do believe we have members of the State Police Lab available. So are there any questions or comments with regard to either of these items? All right, next we have the Suffolk County Crime Lab. email chain dated June 28th of this year. This is an item, again, that was on our commission agenda previously at the June meeting. I believe Jessica had requested additional reports. I believe the lab did provide redacted copies of those reports. I think the lab has also indicated that they've completed the monitoring phase of their investigation and that they've closed this corrective action out. My reading indicates A&AB has also acknowledged receipt of the closeout documentation. Any questions or comments with regard to this item?
Just to thank the lab for providing the redacted lab reports. I think it was very helpful in just understanding the nature of the changes or the corrections, the corrected reports. So that was very useful to review.
Thank you. Next, we have executive session. The next item on the agenda, or next items, are for executive session. So do I have a motion to go into executive session to discuss matters relating to either a current investigation or matters that may lead to the appointment, promotion, demotion, discipline, or suspension of a particular person?
So moved.
Do I have a second? Thank you, Judge. I vote yes. Ann?
Yes.
Jill?
Yes.
Lydia?
Yes.
Jessica?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
Judge?
Yes.
And Bill?
Yes.
All right, so we are going to go into executive session at this point. So if you're not either a commission member or representative of a commission member or staff, somehow technologically, we're going to lock you out of the room. So why don't we take a 5-minute break and resume in 5 minutes, and hopefully we'll have the technology set up so we just have those folks who are appropriate for executive session.
Just one more second, please. I'm trying to connect with YouTube. Thank you for the wait. We are now live on YouTube and recording on WebEx.
Great, thank you. We're back in regular session. The commission did take action in regular session and is asking A&AB to conduct additional work on behalf of the commission. Is that sufficient, Natasha?
Yes, that's fine.
Great. Our next meeting is December 3rd. We will be in touch in terms of whether that's virtual or live. With that, thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time and the conversation and discussion. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved.
Second?
Sure.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Anyone want to stay here and continue? All right, thank you, everybody. Take care. Hope everyone has a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. Appreciate everything. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Great job, Elizabeth. You did well.